More countries are being caught in the demographic trap between rising population and falling incomes. As with food, it is per capita income that counts, not total output. While economies are expanding all over the world, people nearly everywhere are becoming poorer. In China, it was this inescapable crunch of numbers that jolted the government out of its complacency about population.
The Chinese had a terrible shock with the census. They thought they had about 900 million or a billion people, and it turned out they had 1.1 billion. And that immediately made a lot of their vaunted economic progress non-progress, because they had been talking about per capita gains and they had miscounted the capitas. The divisor was larger than they thought. And they did a rough economic inventory and decided that an ideal population size was 900 million or fewer, and instituted the one-child family program to try and not only stop their population growth, but reduce their population size.
China's birth control program is controversial. There have been reports of heavy-handed compulsion by the communist regime, and persistent rumors that thousands of female babies have been killed at birth to make way for boys as the family's single allotted child. These are disturbing allegations, but they should not obscure the outstanding feature of China's success. It's due in large part to raising the status of women. The highest birth rates tend to be in societies where the status of women is lowest. Men are often reluctant to cooperate in family planning. Birth control becomes the woman's responsibility. But often, neither contraception nor sterilization is available due to cost or distance or cultural barriers. The president of Family Care International, Dr. Jill Sheffield.
2/3 of women in the developing world don't have choices to do with contraceptive use. They don't have access to quality services. Many times they don't even have access to poor quality service, and this is one of the problems. That means that the demographers estimate that roughly 1/3 of all children born each year are unwanted. Those unwanted pregnancies have untold problems related to them.
Education is the key to raising women's status. Worldwide, women with no formal education bear more than 6 children on average. University-educated women have about 2. Tragically, illiteracy amongst both girls and boys is rising in the third world.
We know that in large numbers of the developing countries of the world, women don't really make decisions about childbearing for themselves, no matter what their personal views are. They are sort of coerced in a manner of speaking by their societies, by their husbands, by their in-laws, by what is expected of them. Most women in South Asia or Africa believe that childbearing and being a wife is their role in life. So therefore, why should she be educated? Why should she be equipped to stand on her own feet? And that in that role of wife and mother, she's totally subjugated.
But even with better education and higher status, women will not be released from the bondage of unwanted pregnancy until better contraceptives are available. The ideal contraceptive, one that is cheap, totally effective, risk-free, and simple enough to use without medical aid, has yet to be discovered. Since the early 1980s, research efforts have been crippled by the Delcon Shield tragedy. Thousands of women were injured by the Delcon IUD. The damage settlements bankrupted the A.H. Robbins Company, its American manufacturer. The Delcon suit scared nearly every North American pharmaceutical company out of the field of contraceptive research. Fortunately, the search for better contraceptives has been continued by non-profit groups working with private companies in Europe. Their task is enormous. Many different contraceptives are required to meet the needs and preferences of diverse cultures. All the known devices must be improved, and new methods are urgently needed. One of the most promising of these is an implant under the skin which protects a woman for 5 years against pregnancy. Much of the research on Norplant was done by the Population Council of New York. Research Director, Dr. Rosemary Tao.
Você está assistindo The Nature of Things, Ciência em Camp.
We've just done a study at the Population Crisis Committee that suggests that for perhaps half of the world's poor couples, the cost of modern contraception is prohibitive. For example, our study showed that in Ethiopia, the cost of a year's worth of condoms was equal to 1/3 of average annual income in Ethiopia.
Financial support from the wealthy nations is woefully inadequate. Only 1% of all foreign aid goes into family planning. And for at least a decade, funding of birth control programs has been crippled by politics.
That innocent unborn child has a right to life.
Under pressure from pro-life lobbies, the United States has withdrawn funding from international family planning organizations because they contribute to China's birth control program, which is suspected of forcing some women to have abortions. As a result, birth control projects around the world have been shelved for lack of money. China's birth control industry was put together quickly and had to be improvised. The output is impressive, billions of condoms and birth control pills, but the quality is low and the products don't always work. American aid, now suspended, was badly needed to modernize the factories.
We were very unhappy about the American withdrawal of funding, because it now blocks our effort to produce the modern contraceptives. So the net effect in China of the American withdrawal will be more abortions.
8 to 10 million abortions a year are performed in China, most of them because of contraceptive failure. There's no telling how many abortions or how many unwanted births in dozens of countries are the result of the politics of birth control in the United States. Certainly, there is a connection.
Everybody else is scrambling to make up the fact that the United States has withdrawn funding for UNFPA on utterly dishonest and specious and indefensible grounds. They lie and they know it. They said they can't give any money because some of it is used for coercive abortion in China, when in fact their own congressional investigations have shown that is not true. Here's a country that can find tens of billions of dollars to fight a Gulf War. It can't find relative pennies to deal with one of the world's most difficult issues.
During President Reagan's 2 presidential terms, the world's population grew by 700 million people. Unfortunately, President Bush shows no indication of changing those Reagan-era policies and of reestablishing the United States government in a position of leadership on this issue around the world.
Lack of support for birth control programs is largely responsible for the 50 to 60 million abortions performed worldwide each year. Half of them are illegal and many are botched, killing an estimated 200,000 women. Lester Brown.
We also know that stabilizing population, and there are a dozen countries all in Europe that have now stabilized their population, has not been achieved by any country that did not have both well-developed family planning services and abortion as a backup. We still do not have any perfect contraceptives, and until we do, we will need to back up contraceptive failures with abortion.
Together with family planning, economic development is believed to hold the key to controlling population. Experience in wealthy industrialized nations has shown that birth rates fall as living standards rise. Couples tend to put careers and consumer spending ahead of having large families. Birth rates in many Western countries have fallen below replacement level, despite baby bonuses and other incentives to have more children. Unfortunately, in poor countries, development has not had the same effect.
All of the emphasis seems to be on economic growth rather than on the consequences of that economic growth for individuals. So the investment in the social sectors seem to always suffer the first cuts, which to me, is sort of then making a lie of the statement that development is for improving the levels of living of people. And obviously it's not. It's development is for raising the GNP of the country without it benefiting individuals.
Too many third world countries have pinned their hopes on mega projects like strip mines and hydroelectric dams. Western development in poor countries has driven millions from their homes. Vast tracts of farmland and forest have been destroyed. Local elites and multinational corporations benefited. Most people are much worse off. Time has run out for many countries. Exploding populations have forced millions off the land and into cities. It's the biggest mass migration in history. Our response is always the same: limited foreign aid and unlimited economic growth. It's an easy way of avoiding hard questions about sharing our wealth with the poor nations of the South.
But you've said that really it's in the industrialized world where we have the high per capita consumption that we have the population problem. What do we have to tell them to do?
Well, in countries like the United States and Canada, what we have to tell our leaders to do is to make sure that population control and population policy move to the top of our national agendas, because we cannot tell other countries what to do, but we can set an example for other countries. The United States, for years, has had the preposterous situation of having big debates on immigration policy without having a population policy. It's sort of like debating how many people an hour you should be able to load on an airplane without knowing how many people the airplane's able to carry. We simply have to understand that our birth rate has to be low enough to allow that in the aggregate, the United States population should be shrinking.
Shrinking population. Does this apply to Canada? Aren't we supposed to be an empty country? Only 26.5 million people spread over a huge landmass. After all, our birth rate has fallen below the replacement level, and all the increase in our population beyond the end of the century is expected to come from immigration. Nearly 20 million new Canadians over the next 40 years at projected rates.
More than 10 million of those people are expected to settle in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. We tend to see cities like these as evidence that we can accommodate many more people. But cities are not self-sustaining. They make huge demands on the rest of the country for water, energy, raw materials, food, and waste disposal. Does Canada really have enough resources to support 20 million more people? This is a contentious issue that has sparked heated debate. Sociologist Morton Winefield.
If we consider the 10% of Canada's land mass which is inhabited, if that 10% were as densely populated as Holland, which I'm not advocating, but if it were, there would be 400 million people living in that 10% of Canada's land mass. So clearly there is room in Canada for additional population. Some people wonder about whether Canada's agricultural potential would be sufficient to sustain greater numbers of people. Here again, a comparative perspective can help. People have an image of Canada's land as being largely barren, a frozen north and wasteland. But in fact, comparing Canada to Mexico, which is topical in light of the possible free trade agreement, Canada has almost double the arable land of Mexico, but only less than one-third of Mexico's population. So clearly, again, Canada is very advantaged in terms of natural resources, land mass, and agricultural potential.
Every region of Canada is a net food importer with the exception of the prairies. Our economy is declining, our environment is declining, while our debt is increasing. We have to recognize these realities. In Canada, we've been consuming more than we produce from a point of view of both the environment and the economy. If we don't integrate immigration into a population policy with an industrial strategy, what we will have is continued decline. And right now, immigration is just a political knee-jerk policy based on the blowing winds of the time.
So, what is the right number of people for Canada? Ultimately, that will not be determined by political decision. It will be set by the resilience of our environment. The sheer size of the country is no guarantee that Canada will be able to support more people than it does now. The limiting factors are soil, water, climate, and all of the other life support systems of the country. Measuring that carrying capacity will be very difficult, but there is simply no other realistic foundation for a population policy. Você está assistindo The Nature of Things, Ciência e Natureza.
Widow Eva!